Thanks very much, Etienne, and it's really nice to be here. I'm going to get a 5-minute warning, but otherwise I'm going to get cracking right away. Okay, so sitting at home about 6.5 years ago now, and with 2 years of sabbatical leave ahead of me, the idea of writing a population history of India suddenly popped into my mind. It was a crazy idea. It was a crazy idea because, amongst other things, other than for the 20th and a little bit of the 19th century, I knew zero about India's general history, let alone its population history. So in deciding to do this, I was embarking on a journey into the unknown, really into the unknown. I didn't know what it would cover, and I had no idea how long it would take. Notice the luxury of that, because most of my younger colleagues today, they have to produce stuff all the time. It's a crazy world. Anyhow, I did know of 4 publications which would help me, at least particularly for the 20th and also the 19th century. So the first one, obviously, Kingsley Davis is a great book. Notestein provides the foreword to the book, and Daphne Notestein provides the wonderful maps and figures in the book. It took Davis 8 years to do, and it involved numerous assistants. It must have done, given what it is. The second article here, by Leela and Praveen Visaria, also has a strong OPR connection because both of them did their PhDs here. And this particular article in the Cambridge Economic History of India draws very heavily upon Leela's dissertation, which was submitted in 1972. The third publication is by, I haven't seen him for 25 years, Shumit Guha. He's down now at the University of Texas, and he's one of very few Indian historians who have looked at population matters. And I should also say to you that very few Indian demographers have looked at historical matters. Anyhow, it's an excellent, very short book, published by Permanent Black, and the first chapter of the book deals with ancient times, and so is particularly interesting. And finally, there's a book which I edited back in 1989, foreword by Kingsley Davis. I draw on several papers for the book, but particularly by the chapter by P.M. Murray Bhatt, which itself draws on his PhD thesis at Penn. Now, in fact, actually writing this population history of India involves, or it led me to the work of all sorts of people, usually not demographers, usually not historians, who nevertheless have made major contributions to the field, and most of whom I had never heard of before, a majority of these people, and I could probably add another 10 or 15 names to that list. So all of these people have building blocks to what I've eventually sort of assembled. And I could add other names as well. But for example, I'd never heard of Josiah Russell. There are some people in the room I know who would know the name, but I suspect the majority of people have not. I had never heard of Jayan Chand. I would say a great Indian economist. There are economists in this room, but I doubt if any of them have heard of Jayan Chand. Anyhow, I won't go through this list in any detail. Writing the book, writing this history, you had to be a magpie. I'd pick up whatever I could from wherever it was, evaluate it, and then use it if I possibly could. Writing the book involved drawing together hundreds and hundreds of different bits of information and then pitting them together in some kind of framework. It's like putting together a jigsaw puzzle where you've only got 5% of the pieces. That's roughly what I've been involved in for most of the last 6 or 7 years. But, and I would say this, but I think the final result is more than 5%. And the key reason for that is the ability one has to draw lessons across space, but particularly across time. So information collected during the early 20th century, for example, helps one in interpreting information back in the 14th century. And I'll give you an example, perhaps, of that. Okay, so I didn't know anything about India's history, so the first thing I did was read some conventional history books of India, and what came out of them constitutes the framework narrative, the framework for the population history. There are a number of advantages of this. One is that you can put in snippets of relevant information for the population according to the time that you're dealing with. Another is that I believe that we can learn, at least in general terms, if there are difficult political times, that may have implications for what was happening to the population, even though that's very sort of speculative. But good times, good political times, maybe would be slightly more conducive for population growth compared with bad, difficult, socio-political times. Okay, so there were some other political considerations that I was aware of 6 or 7 years ago. One is that I'm British, so any reader of the final work should certainly bear that in mind. A second was that I was going to have to confront religion, something that I have largely avoided in my previous academic work, but I couldn't get round it. And finally, I did not anticipate the significant degree to which modern politicians in India have tried to meddle and indeed rewrite aspects of India's history. And that has compounded recent events, although I have simply ignored the attempts to so rewrite. Okay, wow, I hope I'm making good progress. Now to some aspects of the history. You're going to get a huge history, a whirlwind tour, and I'll conk out when I'm told there's 5 minutes more to go. Modern human beings, Homo sapiens, like us, we don't know when they first arrived in the Indian subcontinent, but a plausible guess that is that it's sometime between 60 and 80,000 years ago. I think the evidence is that it was after the Toba super eruption, okay, after 74,000 years ago. When you look at modern data on languages and the sort of genetic studies that are increasingly being undertaken on India's current population, you find an exceptional degree of diversity, both linguistic and genetic. And the general conclusion of this is that for many, many thousands of years, many small groups of modern incomers, of modern human beings, lived in relative isolation from each other. So that's the indications from the genetic and linguistic data. The production of symbolic artifacts seems to have begun about sometime between 20 and 30,000 years ago. And by about 9,500 years ago, that is 7,500 BCE, before the Common Era, there is much evidence of the burial of dead bodies and use of the bow and arrow. Now, I find myself lucky in that I came across the estimates of India's population produced by Colin McEvety. And I bumped into them in a book by Angus Maddison, published shortly before Maddison himself passed away. However, Maddison had a high regard for McEvety, and he reproduces these numbers here, which are estimates of India's population. Of course, they're guesstimates, but they're educated guesstimates produced by Colin McEverty. Okay, so going back about 7,500 BCE, we have this figure of 200,000 precedes the development of agriculture. Agriculture essentially develops in the Baluchistan area of South Asia. By about 5,000 BCE, agriculture is well established in Baluchistan, and by 2000 BCE, the Indus Valley civilization, covering large areas of the Indus Valley of Pakistan and India, is near its height. Now, I can't go into everything about the Indus Valley civilization, but bioarchaeological research throws up some very interesting findings. For example, the inhabitants of this civilization were relatively short in stature compared to their hunter-gatherer predecessors. For example, there is evidence of matrilineal marriage, in the sense that when they do genetic studies of people who are buried together, the women are more closely related than are the men, suggesting that the men may have moved in. The burials also suggest that there was relative gender equality. The quantity and quality of grave goods buried with women is broadly similar to those buried with men. And the bioarchaeological data also suggest that with the collapse of the civilization, let's say about 3,800, 3,700, 3,600 years ago, there was an upsurge of disease. There's evidence of malaria, for example, apparently in the skeletal remains. Perhaps the single most important population conclusion about the Indus Valley civilization is that it was probably by far the most populous of the ancient world. It involved several areas of relatively dense population settlement. So the surmise is that there were probably many more people living there than, for example, in the Yellow River Basin, or in Mesopotamia, or in Egypt. Now, the sorts of figures that a number of people come up with for the number of people, most of them living in the Indus Valley civilization, 4, 5, 6 million. McEverty comes up with 6 million, but that's the sort of range. So this civilization goes into fairly rapid decline. We could talk about why, but I'm not going to. And there is evidence of the abandonment of cities, and there is a shift over the next 1,000 years or so of the center of gravity of the population from the Indus Valley into the Ganges Basin. And at roughly the same time, there is the intrusion through the northwest of what are sometimes termed Indo-Aryan influences and peoples. So there's some sort of migration in, and this leads eventually to the speaking of Indo-European languages throughout most of the north of the Indian subcontinent, which applies even today. And it helps to explain the structural similarities between, for example, Bengali and English, or Gaelic. And genetic evidence, this chap Reich up at Harvard, is at least consistent with some of these conclusions. Now, between about 400 and 600 BCE, there is a second urbanization which takes place in the Ganges Basin, and many of the modern cities that you find in India effectively were founded at around that time. City-states grow up around these cities, and then they become, to some extent, loosely confederated together in the so-called Mauryan Empire, which rules about 200 to 300 BCE. Now here, for the first time, we have some quantitative information related to the population. And it comes not from India itself, but from Latin and Greek sources. In particular, an individual called Megasthenes visited Pataliputra, which is modern-day Patna in Bihar, and he gives us some numbers in what he observed. He observed, for example, he gives the measurements of Pataliputra, a great city at that time, modern-day Patna. But the measurements show that Pataliputra was a riverside strip. It was long and thin along the south bank of the Ganges, just as modern-day Patna is now. And Megasthenes also gives a number for the size of Chandragupta Maurya's army. And the number is about 600,000. So here's another generalization, and that is that Indian historians, and I'm fond of them, but like most of us, they tend to exaggerate. On the basis of this 600,000 number, a number of historians suggested that the population of India as a whole at this time, Todd, was 100 million, 140 million, 180 million, you know, those sorts of numbers. Well, there's no way. There's no way. And a work by Josiah Russell and by Shumit Guha leads me to think that at the time of Chandragupta Maurya there may have been something like 15 to 30 million. I won't go into the details of that. There's not enough time. Okay, so I'm now going to deal with the next 1,200 years. The next 1,200 years, taking us to about the year 1000. Yeah, wow. What the hell can I say about that? Well, we have the establishment of communities on the western coast, communities of Christians and Jews, Arab traders, probably from, we don't know really when these communities were established, but in the case of the Syrian Christian community in Kerala, probably about in the 4th century, something like that. That's a guess. There is the control of Sindh is taken by Muslim Arab armies around 712, and that leads, amongst other things, somewhat later to the establishment of small Zoroastrian communities, essentially refugees from modern-day Iran in southern Gujarat. Zoroastrians being corresponding to Parsis in terms of contemporary India. On the eastern side, we have city-states growing up on the coastal plain, and of course you then have, over the next 1,000 years or so, the so-called Indianization of Southeast Asia, written about by George Codes, and the establishment of Hindu kingdoms in various parts of Southeast Asia. But the one thing I want to concentrate on very briefly about this long period of time is the visit to India of Huangshan. Actually, there were several Chinese who visited at roughly this time. A Chinese Buddhist pilgrim. He visited, as you can see, for about 14 years, and he traveled very widely in the subcontinent. Now, in a nutshell, the interesting thing about this chap is that, again, he makes empirical statements about the population, things that you would recognize as such. He, for example, talks about traveling through vast unpopulated lands. He talks, for example, about visiting certain areas where there were evident declines in population. And perhaps most remarkably of all, again, he provides measurements. He provides measurements of the circumferences, and in certain cases of both the length and the width of major cities. Now, yeah, it is a wow. It is a wow. Now, I can't possibly go through the details, and the calculations are truly heroic. Truly heroic. But nevertheless, Josiah Russell uses these data to suggest that the population of the subcontinent as a whole was in the region of 50 million. And in calculations that can be described as even more truly horrific, not horrific, heroic, I come up with a figure of 58 million. Okay, I reworked the numbers. Obviously, you shouldn't. But the point is, there weren't 100 million people. There weren't 180 million. That's for absolute sure. Okay, so now we're going to come through to a 700-year period, beginning with the year 1000 and ending around 1707, which is the year of the death of Aurangzeb, the great Mughal emperor. Now, in this period, one begins to pepper in more and more snippets of information. I can't go through all these snippets, but I'm going to give you a few of them. For example, there was a very severe famine which affected northern India in 1291. In 1398, Delhi was sacked by Mongol forces very severely. Irfan Habib suggests that it was at least 2 centuries before Delhi reached its previous level. Syphilis seems to have been introduced very shortly after Vasco da Gama and his crew visited the western coast of India around 1498. And then, when we come on to the Mughal period, which reaches its height during the 17th century, there's all sorts of information. A remarkable French doctor, there were several remarkable French visitors, in fact, who kept records, relevant records, but a man called Francois Bernier lived in the Mughal Empire and made all sorts of empirical statements. Mumtaz Mahal, you've all heard of Mumtaz Mahal. She was married for 19 years, and I think it's a historical fact that in those 19 years of marriage, she had 12 live births and 2 stillbirths. Wet nursing was almost certainly practiced in the Mughal imperial household. The modern Indian historian Shireen Moosby, very distinguished, has looked at these data for the Mughal household and suggests that the level of infant mortality was 380 per thousand, 38%. And incidentally, a lot of those children died from smallpox, which is quite interesting. However, for me, there are 3 big issues looking at the could I steal some of your water? Looking at the. There are 3 big issues looking at this 700-year period. The first is, was India affected by the Black Death? Okay. Well, there are widely contrasting views on this. William, how the hell we got there? William McNeill finds it impossible to believe that the subcontinent was not affected, whereas George Sussman, who's up at City University, New York, and I really recommend his his work, thinks that it was almost certainly did not affect India. Thank you very much. Well, so you have to sift through all the evidence. There's absolutely no doubt that there was no major die-off. Okay? So the subcontinent was not very badly afflicted in the way that Europe or the Middle East and probably China, according to Sussman, were. However, like McNeill, I find it impossible to believe that there weren't outbreaks on the north, in the northwest, given the very close contacts that there were between the Delhi Sultanate and areas in the Middle East that definitely were badly afflicted. And in particular, there is a statement written in Damascus, actually, by the Arab historian Ibn al-Wadi. He says, he wrote in 1349, that the plague afflicted the Indians, it weighed upon the Sind. So I think the answer is, there would have been outbreaks, probably, but there's no direct evidence for it, other perhaps than this statement. The second major issue is the size of the population around 1595. At the time of the Emperor Akbar, you've all heard of him, there are surviving documents which gives statistics on the cultivated area for much of northern India that was under the control of the Mughal Empire. But not all of northern India that was controlled by the Mughal Empire. In particular, Bengal is not covered in these statistics, and the south of India is not covered as well. Now, the historian W.H. Moreland, writing in the 1920s, was the first to use these data to suggest that they might provide the basis for a tentative estimate of the size of the population. Basically, what he did was he took the ratio of the cultivated area around 1595 to the cultivated area around 1891, when a modern census was taken, and then used that ratio to make an estimate of the size of the population. Okay, that's a very quick surmise of what, outline of what he did. On that basis, he came up with 100 million, which he thought was on the low side. It's very heroic indeed, but nevertheless, he led the way. Now, you can see that a number of other people have made estimates. Irfan Habib, extremely distinguished Marxist historian, and his student Shireen Moosli, who I've already mentioned, they come up with figures well above 140 million. I think, and I won't go into the details, that a figure of about 125 million, which happens to be the figure that Kingsley Davis used, is as good a number as any, but it's obviously very rough. I think there were more than 100 million, but not up in the 140 million. But of course, one can't prove it. The third major issue that I address for this period is the level of urbanization. Now, historians like Habib and Moosli, using data from the same source, the Ain-e Akbari, suggests that the level of urbanization in Mughal India was about 15%. And this figure is widely cited. All I can do is to say that I think it's highly implausible for a very large pre-industrial population that the level of urbanization was as high as 15%. And amongst other things, looking at other people who have looked for parts of Asia or Asia as a whole, the really classic work by John Grauman at the UN puts Asia as a whole at 5% urban around 1600. Angus Madison, drawing on Gilbert Rosman, who I understand is here at Princeton, puts China's level of urbanization at 4%. There were a few countries, small countries in Europe around 1600 that may have approached 15% urban, but they were small places and not a huge agricultural population. So I don't believe for a moment that the level of urbanization was 15%. It was less than that. I suspect well under 9%, but I can't give you a number. But this is important for our knowledge of India, because if you start with 15% around 1600, what you imply is subsequent major decline or de-urbanization. And to cut a long story short, I don't buy the argument. I don't buy the argument. It's tied up with de-industrialization, particularly in the 19th century with cotton goods, particularly from Lancashire in Britain. But I don't buy the de-urbanization aspect of it, and I go into this in some detail. Okay, so now we come to the 18th century. The 18th century essentially sees, massive simplifications, the collapse of the Mughal Empire, and then in the second part of the century, the rise of British control, which is established by early in the 19th century. And there's no doubt, by the way, that it's a rocky time. Okay, it's a rocky time. However, most people who have looked at this, including people such as Durga Prasad Bhattacharya and John Durrant, a name that is certainly well known in this room, but others as well, suggest that during the 18th century the population as a whole was either roughly constant or there was slight growth. Okay? Shumat Guha, in this context, on the basis of almost pure conjecture, thinks that there may have been a 15 to 20% decline in the population towards the end of the 19th century. And again, in a nutshell, I don't buy this. So people who think that there was no growth or that there was a decline cite a number of events. In particular, they cite very severe famines, which certainly did occur, and certainly the British were sometimes culpable and did very little to ease the situation. These famines, such as the one that affected much of northern India in 1782-84, when it's said that half the population died, or more famously, the 1769-70 famine in Bengal, in which scholar after scholar after scholar after scholar says that a third of the population died. The population was about 30 million, so there were 10 million dead. Doesn't sound plausible to me. And it certainly didn't sound plausible to Watkins and Mencken, who, writing specifically about this famine, state that this is probably an instance of where the numbers of deaths are largest when the supporting evidence is skimpiest. Yeah, I think that's the case. It was a major famine, a calamitous famine, but not 10 million deaths. Detailed historical research done by someone called Rajat Datta, who is now a professor of history at JNU University, indicates that 10 million deaths is a largely inflated figure. So we don't know what the scale of mortality was. It was probably several million, but not 10 million. Probably not 5 million, but that's just a judgment. And the same thing relates to a warfare in at the end, particularly of the 18th century. Roland Ladinois, in the book that I edited, that's the basis for the 15 to 20% decline in population. Well, I've re-looked at these statistics, and the data that he uses, particularly for 2 districts, they're simply, incredibly rough. So a 15 to 20% reduction, no. Other historians, such as Brian Merton, I don't know him, but I did used to know Dharma Kumar well, suggest that mortality was relatively light. That doesn't mean to say that everything was hunky-dory, far from it. But looking at this century as a whole, there's no particular reason to think that the population reduced in size. Well, now we come on to the beginning of the 19th century. And what really happens, of course, is there's more and more empirical data. And you can't always accept it at face value. You need to look through it carefully. But some of the numbers in this column here, these are city population estimates. Some of them come from what were no doubt rough censuses. But I think they can be taken as broadly plausible. Many of them, not all of them, but anyhow. For example, there were a number of enumerations in Calcutta at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th, and they're suggesting numbers of roughly 200,000, maybe 220, 230,000. So I think the number that we've got here for Calcutta is probably rough, but nevertheless of the right order of magnitude. Now, there's other early evidence that becomes available at this time. For example, take the name Anna de Still. Anna de Still. Anna de Still was the first person ever to be vaccinated in India. She was a 3-year-old Anglo-Indian girl, and she was vaccinated in June of 1803. And we have a lot of information of that level of detail, though not always so significant. I'm going to skip over Malthus, Malthus, it wasn't meant to be a joke. Malthus was appointed to the first chair of political economy in the English-speaking world in 1805 at Haileybury College. He didn't write much about India, but this quote was Jack Corwell directed me to it. He was interested in the custom of early and universal marriage in India, as a result of which he wrote in 1803 that the population would thus be pressed hard against the limits of the means of subsistence, and the food of the country would be meted out to the major part of the people in the smallest shares that could support life. In such a state of things, every failure in the crops from unfavourable seasons would be felt most severely, and India, as might be expected, has in all ages been subject to the most dreadful famines. Now, I do address in the book, drawing very much on Jack, I hasten to add, the consequences of Malthus for the British interpretation of India's demography during the 19th century. So far as much of northern Gangetic India is concerned, particularly the upper Ganges basin, much of the experience of that time is not so far away from that. There were repeated famines. But South India generally and Eastern India were relatively famine-free. Bengal, well, there was very substantial population growth occurring. Okay, so now we have the period from 1821 to 1871, and what we get is more and more data. Census enumerations, some are listed at the top there for Madras. The establishment of death registration from the mid-1860s and birth registration from the mid-1870s transforms the situation. Around 1870, we have the first quasi-national census, and on that basis, Kingsley Davis put the population at about 255 million. By 1901, the population under full civil registration in India was 220 million. That is about 13% of the human population at the time. And I'll put all of these words in bold. The huge number of annual provincial sanitary reports for India may well constitute the largest body of generally unanalyzed historical demographic data in the world. You don't have it in the United States. So students studying here can't use the data. They do exist in India, much of it in the National Archives, but it's damn hard to locate. A project for me and Ravindran Gopinath, in my retirement, him running the University of Kerala and another university as well, is to try and digitize all of these data, because there are as much data for India as for the whole of Western Europe. Yeah, it's an absolutely incredible data source. Okay, well, this was a period of population growth. You fool around with various numbers, but I think this period saw a growth rate of from 0.3 to 0.4% per year. The growth seems to have been greater in the south and the east of the subcontinent, and much less in the more settled northern core. So just to give you an idea of some of the richness of this data, I'll show you 3 or 4 graphs. There's a whole story behind this. These are smallpox death rates in Calcutta. There's a whole story behind it. Incredible story behind it, but what you can see is that after this disaster in 1865, vaccination was brought in and with force, and the disease went away. Now let's snip forward to the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. Here are registered plague deaths. Enters in 1896, there's a huge increase in mortality, and then it gradually reduces for various reasons that I can't possibly go into now. The British took very forceful, often racially inspired actions to try and stamp out plague. And one of the consequences of that was to support the nationalist movement. Very interesting way in which disease has political repercussions. Okay, here are some. There's a man called Arthur Geddes. Some wonderful maps. He was a geographer. Wonderful maps. And he whole maps of India on a district level basis. They're incredibly rich. But here are just four trajectories, typical trajectories that he isolates for covering most of the country, and particularly in the consequence of malaria. So in Jessore district, in the western side of the Ganges-Brahmaputra delta, we have population stagnation, a very high load of endemic malaria, essentially. Further east in the same delta, in Noakhali, very little malaria and what Geddes referred to as high natural increase. In the west, behind the Western Ghats, in the rain shadow area of central India and western India, we have a pattern of recurrent crisis. There is population growth and then a mixture of famines and malaria epidemics. So the population reduces. So it's an up and down trajectory, as you can see. And finally, another of his trajectories he calls colonization. This is from a district which is today in Pakistan. And indeed, Kingsley Davis writes very much about the population consequences of the building of canals in what is today Punjab. And finally, I've done a lot of work on the time series data for an area of central India called Berar. For almost any year. Do you want to know what the age pattern of mortality was? Measured by, I don't know, the beta coefficient in the two-parameter logic life table system? You can do it. And you can get data on the cause of death structure and on the price of rice or the price of sorghum or whatever it may be. So this is a hugely, and you've got the demographic transition in there and all sorts of other things as well. Okay, so I'm coming near the end, he said. We started 2 minutes late, give me that. So now we'll deal with 1871 to 1921, famines, plague and influenza, and that is much of the story of that time. Famines, huge famines. Arat Maharatna has done a lot of work on this. The 1876-78 famine was an utter disaster, terrible British culpability, many millions of deaths. But as Jean Drèze, amongst others, has shown, over the following 30 years, essentially famine prevention efforts were brought in and famine mortality was vastly reduced. Famines, like plague, of course, were used for political purposes, quite rightly, to bolster the nationalist movement. Kingsley Davis, famously, in his book, estimates influenza mortality in 1918 at 20 million. It wasn't that high. There's been several studies, one of them, amongst others, by Ken Hill. A figure of something like 12 million is probably closer to the true number. But nevertheless, 12 million excess deaths in 4 months, most of it in northwestern India, an absolute catastrophe. But the influenza did not have any political consequences because it was over before it had begun, in a sense. Very quick. Now, what we see is that the fall in famine mortality was certainly important in accounting for the improved mortality of the 1920s and 1930s compared to this 50-year period when the population, again, probably grew at something like 0.3% per year. Of course, now we have census data to justify that. However, there were other factors which helped to contribute to this mortality decline of the 1920s and 1930s. Well, this is the penultimate slide, Doug and Etienne. I'm not going to go into the birth control movement, which really takes off early in the 20th century, but it's a great story. It's a great and important story in human history, and you've got the names there of some of the Indian pioneers of the birth control movement in India. Two names that are not there, but I'll mention them anyhow. One is Annie Besant. Some people in the room have heard of Annie Besant. She was involved in the Bradlaugh-Besant trial, which took place in London in, I think, about 1876, when she and Bradlaugh published a seditious American publication, The Fruits of Philosophy. It was all about contraception and birth control. Anyhow, Annie Besant then went on to India. She was president of the Indian National Congress, amongst other things, and she was relevant, very relevant. And another person, someone I knew, was a woman called Avabai Wadia. Again, there may be one or two people in the room. Avabai Wadia died in 2005. She was president of IPPF, and before she died, she wrote a huge, thick book of her life. It's called The Light Is Ours. And she then IPPF sent copies to all sorts of people. I suspect there'll be a copy somewhere in Princeton, and I read it. It's full of the most remarkable information, detailed information about the brave people that made the family planning movement. And I've drawn upon it substantially. Okay. So far as partition is concerned, in 1947, a number of studies, again, Ken Hill has been active on this, suggest that about 14 to 18 million people moved at partition, but it's very difficult to estimate the scale of the associated mortality. It may have been 1 or 2 or even 3 million, but it's difficult really to know. I will talk briefly about the Bengal famine of 1943-44, because I'm sorry to say that the analysis that is so often quoted, that of Amartya Sen on this famine, is, I think, deeply flawed. It's deeply flawed in terms of the causes of the famine and the consequences of the famine. About 8 years ago, Doug asked me to write a paper for the Annual Review of Sociology. I had not heard of the publication. I was delighted to do it. But if you want really gripping reading, read the Annual Review of Phytopathology. Yeah, the Annual Review of Phytopathology for 1973. There's a paper in that by S.Y. Padmanabhan, which produces stunning data on agricultural yields during the famine, rice yields during the famine, and the scale of the reduction for the Amman crop of 1943. So there was a food availability decline in this famine. I don't think there's much doubt about it. If you're readers of the New York Review of Books, go back to about 2010. If you're readers of the journal Food Policy, go back to about 1984, because there are people who really have a go at SEN, and I'm afraid I'm broadly speaking on their side. Okay, so now I'm going to conclude with 2 observations. Well, basically there's very rapid mortality decline in this period. Life expectation at birth may increase by 10 years in 5 or 6 years. Very important period, something that's often missed out by demographers. And so we have the population growing, whereas in the 1921-41 it's at 1.2% per year. For this period, it's 2% per year, and it's only the 2001-2011 intercensual decade that it really drops below 2% per year. I'm going to skip all of this nonsense and just address the 2 last points here. Right. So having finished this book, I could say a billion things, but I'm going to talk about 2 points. The first question is to ask, how does India's experience relate to what is known about world population history? Now, in this context, I'm particularly interested with the contrast between India on the one hand and experience in East Asia and in Europe on the other. Because as McEvedy and Jones write, looking at the last 2,000 years, that events at opposite ends of the Eurasian landmass have an astonishing synchronicity. And they do. Periods of warming tend to go with population growth. Periods of cooling tend to go with a reduction or even negative growth. Look also in this context at the work of Patrick Galloway. Now, it partly reflects seems to reflect or relate to climate fluctuations. It partly reflects diseases. Remember what I said about the Black Death? Certainly devastated Europe and the Middle East. It seems to have had a major effect in China, at least if Sussman is correct. And also social phenomena. I mentioned the Mongols, sacking of Delhi, but the Mongols were a bit of a nuisance in northern areas of South Asia, and the Huns too. Huangzhang makes statements which may reflect desolation brought about by Han intruders in northern India. So, how does India relate to this? The short answer is we don't know, because the numbers are not sufficiently detailed. But, what the hell? Well, I might as well speculate. So I speculate that any synchronicity for population trends, broad population trends in the Indian subcontinent will have been weaker and dampened due to a generally warmer climate, it's not in the temperate zone, a generally warmer climate, greater diversity, not just linguistic and genetic, but greater diversity in climate, in crops, etc. And above all, the fact of the Himalayas. The Himalayas restricted the Huns, it restricted the Mongols, and all those other forces which devastated populations in both the east and west of Eurasia. And then my final point, then I'm going to shut up. As I wrote this book, I found myself increasingly asking the question, well, why are all the empirical facts about the population of India, why are so many of them coming from outside? Megasthenes was a Greek. Huangzhang was Chinese. So we're getting indications, particularly with English and Russian and French and Portuguese sources when we're moving into the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. So for most of history, why does most of the empirical data about India's population come from outside, from these sorts of sources, sometimes Arab sources? Does it reflect socio-political instability? The Chinese, after all, had a relatively stable structure, for much of the time at least. Does it reflect the poorer survival of documentary evidence in a warmer and wetter climate? Possibly these things are relevant, or is it reflective of something more profound? And I think it is reflective of something more profound. And I'm not the only person who thinks this. It occurred to me as I was doing all this work, what the hell is it? Well, next week I'm having lunch with Robert Casson, okay? Next week I'm having lunch with Robert Casson in London, and Robert is married to Shu, and Shu is Chinese. And she writes books and she does TV documentaries. And she did a TV documentary on Huangzhang. And Huangzhang came into India, he collected all of this data and he went outside. And so the question is, why are the Indians so lacking in this particular respect? And Shu interviews the man who was, I think, Secretary of the Indian Council of Historical Research, a man called R.C. Agrawal. And he says, and I think there's truth in this, actually, he says the Indians are philosophical, spiritual, and transcendental. For us Hindus, this life is only transitory. So what is history and historical knowledge but a kind of unnecessary baggage? That's it.